There is a direction to reality, but what is its nature and cause, and the implications? Bruce Charlton. Before I became a Christian, and on the basis mainly of my academic work in biology, I was convinced that there was a long-term direction to reality, at least to reality on Earth since its presumed formation, and that the direction was towards increased complexity. This led to a strong focus on complex systems theory. However, further work revealed that complexity cannot be detected or measured in any genuinely objective manner. Which means that, insofar as the above is true, the study field of complex systems has smuggled in human consciousness, unacknowledged. I was eventually more or less compelled to acknowledge that the directionality came from a divine source, and that the long-term direction was more of the nature of consciousness than complexity. Which insight I got mostly from Owen Barfield, and also some aspects of Rudolf Steiner. So I am convinced there is a strategy to reality over the very long term, and that it is of divine origin, and has to do with working towards higher consciousness. Yet I still do not feel that I have a sure grasp of what is going on, nor how it works, except negatively, by which I mean that the direction does not come wholly from the top down, but derives also from the nature of things, by which I mean that things are actually beings, and there is a direction, an irreversibility, intrinsic to the very nature of beings. And because I understand beings to be eternal, alive, purposive, conscious in origin, capable of self-sustenance, I am inclined to believe that the direction of reality comes from the, in essence, divine nature of all beings, rather than something entirely externally imposed on reality by God. This apparently helps clarify the nature and scope of divine creation, that it is, as Joseph Smith described it, a matter of organization of the pre-existent. It clarifies, also, how it is that increase in consciousness is not, of itself, good. Increasing consciousness is intrinsic to beings, and therefore it is something that God works with. Increasing consciousness is not something that leads towards increased fulfillment of God's creative. Thus a being with higher consciousness is not thereby more good. Consciousness is orthogonal to goodness. In terms of morality, increasing consciousness is a thing that happens, like it or not, over the long term, for any being. Being good, that is living in harmony with God's purposes, living in and from love, is a separate thing. However, there is an interaction between consciousness and goodness, which arises when the reality of increasing of consciousness is denied, or when the attempt is made to reverse the state of consciousness. This falls under the category of an evil, because it is a false, untruthful, understanding of reality, and there cannot be harmony with God's plans, when there is dishonesty, or the attempt to distort or invert reality in conformity with the individual will of any being. In sum, we, as individual beings, have no obligation to seek higher consciousness, but we do have an obligation to acknowledge that consciousness we actually are. Since divine creation incorporates the reality of direction, it is good to acknowledge reality and work from the reality of divine creation, and evil to deny reality and work against divine creation. Red alert warning for extreme heat in UK. Bruce Charlton. Britain burning now, spontaneous fires break out across the nation. The CO2 global warmist climate agenda may be a dubious, indeed nonsensical exploded scam for the majority of the UK population, but for the managerial intellectual class it is a profound spiritual issue, sometimes the most significant problem in the world today. Or, second only to the ultimate historical spiritual catastrophe of the UK pretending to have left the EU. Consequently, the tax-funded, about £300 million PA, and government-controlled weather forecaster the Met Office, function now renamed Weather and Climate Change, has been going berserk in the past few days, because they have been counting down the nation to evidence of a climate emergency with a top-level red alert of danger.
A red heat health alert indicates a risk to life for even the healthy population.
This, because temperatures are guesstimated to reach around the mid-30s Celsius, see 95 degrees Fahrenheit, in some subparts of England, for a day or two. Well, I do not dispute that this is hot, and I dislike hot weather more than most people. Fortunately, we usually avoid the extremes here in at 55 degrees latitude north. But the fact is that literally millions of British holiday makers per summer pay substantial amounts of money to visit Spain, Greece, Turkey, Florida, and other very hot places for their holidays, in order to be confident of temperatures in the mid-30s. Indeed, the climate delusional among the wealthier managerial intellectual class often pay the extra money and personal inconvenience to gravitate to even hotter climes than these, such as Africa, Australia, or South Asia. And yet, somehow, these sun-seekers don't behave as if they were taking their lives in their hands. Indeed, they often look forward to their holidays, and both during and afterwards insist on showing and telling everybody what a great time they had, apparently despite dodging death while battling red alert heat health conditions. In the UK weather forecasting has long since been weaponized, to generate ever more evidence of global warmism. In an island nation famed for its temperate climate, those abroad would scarcely credit the number of front-page news items there are about emergency weather warnings, either predicting record-breaking temperatures, or noting that contrived weather stats, that nobody had ever thought about, or cared about, have been exceeded. For some arbitrary slice of time in a very particular locality. If it is not unseasonably warm conditions, which include pleasantly mild winters, then there are warnings before, during, and after any storms, all of which are given names, because these weather events are supposed to be more frequent and extreme, which is supposed to indicate climate change. And then linking these causally to the latest globalist capitalist, totalitarian imperatives of making colossal profits from parasitically destroying the economy /farming /energy /trade /retail /housing, mass personal transportation etc., aka the climate agenda. The stark fact is that just as the Met Office cannot predict our Atlantic frontal system weather 3 days ahead, except during the rare spells of high pressure, such as now. And nobody in the world can validly predict the future climate of the planet, nor does anybody know what determines climate except for Earth's climate being driven overwhelmingly by the long-term activity of the Sun, which also cannot be predicted. But even if it could validly be known that the UK climate was foresaw going to get warmer, then a very large majority of the population would regard that as a good thing. As should be obvious not just from holiday destinations, but from the tens of millions of those who have, over the past several generations, moved to live abroad permanently, often specifically to live in hotter places. More rough musings on freedom, evil, etc. Francis Berger. I often hear that we are free because God created us from nothing as actual beings. Since we are created, actual beings, we must act. Our actuality dictates it. Yet before we act, we must choose between good and evil, the free will doctrine. I also frequently hear that the only way a perfect omni-God could create authentically free beings with the potential to choose love, reason, and goodness was to grant them the possibility of choosing error, sin, evil, and death. If that possibility to choose evil were not present, we would not really be free because the lack of a choice for evil amounts to a logical contradiction, like a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle. Put another way, to make us authentically free actual creatures, Omni-God had to allow for the possibility of evil choices and actions, otherwise, our freedom would not be really free. Whenever I hear such arguments, I can't help but wonder why said omnigod did not simply create authentically free beings who always freely choose love, reason, and goodness. Such creatures would still be free agents in the sense that they would be performing acts. They would not be hammers. Nor would they be push-button automatons or slaves. They would be free agents liberated from the burden of having to ponder good and evil choices. The above does not entail that they would be actualized beings that possess all possible knowledge. They could still learn. Instead of negative learning, their lives would be filled with nothing but positive learning. All change would be nourishing, life-affirming change. They would grow continuously in love and goodness. So, why didn't an all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful omnigod create such actual creatures? The common rebuttal states that omnigod could not create such creatures because they would be perfect in the same way he is, and perfection cannot create perfection, hence, imperfect but still free actual creatures. However, that doesn't really fly. Aside from definitional games involving the word perfection, there is nothing inherently illogical in creating free agents who lack the possibility for evil choices, and since omnigod can do anything logically possible, he should have been able to create a world brimming with free agents, who did not err and always chose good. The potential to choose evil is not indicative of freedom, nor does it define freedom. Quite the contrary. It signifies slavery of the worst kind. Another common rebuttal is that the omnigod did create such good beings to start with, but Adam and Eve disobeyed God, ate the forbidden fruit, and caused the fall. Okay, but why did omnigod tempt them with his warning not to eat from the tree? Tempt them. Wait a minute, wasn't it Satan who tempted them? God commanded them not to eat from it. Yes, but Satan's temptation may have been far less enticing had it not been preceded by God's explicit command to avoid the evil choice. In fact, you could argue that Adam and Eve may have remained blissfully unaware of the existence of the forbidden fruit had omnigod not drawn their attention to it in such an explicit manner. So, why did omnigod reveal the choice for evil to them? And on the matter of evil choices, where does the stuff for such choices originate? If everything was created ex nihilo, then God not only created us, but he also created our freedom, defined mainly as the potential to choose evil, and the conditions for all of our choices and actions, including, I assume, the conditions for evil choices. Of course, the very definition of omnigod as perfectly good negates the possibility for creating such conditions, yet the conditions are there. And let's not get into non-human kinds of evil like natural disasters and disease. Whatever causes those, it certainly couldn't be omnigod, that's for sure. Now, I understand that all of the above can be explained in all sorts of intricate and acrobatic ways. No, let me back that up. The very fact that much of the above requires intricacy and acrobatics to make sense is all I need to know. Boomer versus Millennial ideology, and potential spirituality. Bruce Charlton. Because of the development of human consciousness, there is necessarily a generational effect in terms of the nature and possibilities when it comes to ideology, and also to spirituality. Biological generations used to be 25 years, but are now more like 30 years, since reproduction became increasingly delayed, and the popular usage of cultural generations actually references, more or less, biological half-generations. On that basis, I would like to compare my post-World War II baby boomer generation with that of their children, who are mostly Generation Y, millennials. Also, in order to confirm apparent trends, we would need to go back to the boomers' parents and their grandparents' generations, in order to get 4 approximate time points. What can be seen across this span is that the size of group with which people effectively identify has become smaller with each generation. And, as a consequence, the group identification has gone from being, at least somewhat, a positive aim, i.e. we favor such and such a state of affairs, i.e. a utopian ideology for my group, to increasingly a double negative value system, i.e. we are against such and such evils, i.e. an anti-my group dystopian ideology. That is, there was an incremental trend from propositional towards oppositional morality and values. The shrinking of group size went from the nation grouping, and/or race, which may number tens of million, down by stages to a minority subculture, a grouping which may be tiny in proportion and/or numbers. And this shrinkage brings with it the de facto impossibility of a utopia, because a plausible utopia cannot be much smaller than a, not too large, nation. By contrast, the modern identity groups are tiny minorities, who cannot realistically aspire to a society organized around their desires, and who consequently are organized around fear and resentment of the majority who in various ways restrict, or potentially might restrict, this minority. Group size shrinkage is also confirmed by the nature of dominant mass media that define, sustain, and amplify group identity. In my childhood, for example, there were just 2 television channels, later rising to 3 then, in 1984, 4. This meant that every TV program had a viewership of many millions, and a high proportion of the relevant population shared, and was shaped by, this experience. The relevant categories with which people identified for boomers and earlier were large, race or nation, social class or sex, and from boomers a large age category such as teenager. And the media-mediated virtual peer groups for example, women or teenagers were also very large both proportionately, and in actual numbers. For boomers, to be an English woman or teenager, was to be one among many millions, with whom one identified. By the time of the millennials, i.e. the boomers' children, there were first videos, then DVDs, then tens or hundreds of TV channels, then broadband access to uncountable sources of entertainment, information, ideology. The attitude changed from being one among millions, to, increasingly, selecting an ever smaller, and self-selected, niche group, with whom one identified. A century ago there was a time when both the religious churches, and anti-religious atheist communist parties, were selective, exerted sometimes extreme discipline and control, i.e. the group entity regulated inclusion and membership. But these organizations, whether churches or anti-religious, have progressively shrunk or collapsed, or else assimilated to the, always changing, profile of the mass mainstream. Millennials do not identify with the mass mainstream, they are instead induced to compliance by SOPs, threats, sanctions, and bribes. Because ideology among millennials and those younger, is extremely niche, the groups must pander in order to recruit and retain members. This is required as there is so little and such feeble psychological, or spiritual, spontaneous group affiliation. But boomer ideology still retains a much greater element of self-influence by the past larger social groupings, than does the ideology of millennials onwards. This may somewhat explain why large/wealthy/powerful/influential organizations have been so reluctant to retire the boomers, so that the biggest institutions/nations seem to prefer or more than demented boomers as leaders, rather than recruiting from the younger generations. Boomers have usually retained the expectations and values of their childhood and youth, from a time and consciousness when the world was segmented into relatively few categories. Consequently, boomers think of the world and the future in terms of few and large functional societal units, whether these units are multinational/global institutions, nations, megacorporations, or whatever. But the boomers are becoming incapacitated and dying, and later generations will not, first because they do not want to, but also because they indeed cannot, perform the same function as did boomers. Later generations have changed, and the world has changed. If such generational change is, as I believe, indeed a consequence of the development of human consciousness, then it is irresistible, and the largest social categories will break down. Human society will then, presumably, fragment, and into ever smaller and less positively cooperative units, and the process may, indeed I think it shall, continue down to the level of individual persons. In other words, human consciousness has been on a trend towards individual autonomy, including personal choice, but this trend has not yet been fully manifested in societal organization. What we fundamentally believe is becoming more and more a matter of our personal choice. Choice includes choice of friends and allies, and choice among mass social media for support, but also and more significantly, the fundamental choice either to believe in what we know to be reality, or instead to live by what we know to be false in fundamental ways, which is what most people are currently doing. Once this process has reached its completion, individual level autonomy of consciousness, and the primacy of choice will then become just a fact of life, an aspect of reality around which we would need to choose to operate. The providential benefits of not getting what we want. Bruce Charlton. My conclusion is that benefits of not getting what we want only happen if we are capable of learning from our life experience. The trouble is that some people are not capable of learning. These are the type who spend their years eaten up with if only regrets, concerning their failure to achieve this or that which, it seems evident, either made no perceptible difference, or could never possibly have yielded the satisfactions they imagine it would, and often enough would have done them harm. The main area for such delusory failings to get is probably sexual relationships. Much of my early life was a sequence of if only with respect to this or that girl, combined with recurrent, and rapid, disillusion about my actual success in sometimes getting who I wanted. Looking back, I am only grateful that I did not always, or usually, get what I then wanted. My early life often seems like a sequence of bullets fortunately avoided, or bullets that hurt but left only light wounds. It would be awarding me way too much kudos to say these bullets were dodged. Mostly this stuff happened to me, rather than me taking responsibility in any serious fashion. I very seldom deserve any credit for avoiding harm, either prospectively or retrospectively, but only for, perhaps belatedly, recognizing and acknowledging that harm had indeed been avoided. And also professionally, career-wise, there were things I worked hard to get or to keep, but failed, and it very often now seems providential that here too I did not get what I most wanted. In some, and with a few supremely important exceptions, it seems that it would have been a distinctly bad thing for me to have gotten those things I most wanted at most phases of my life. It was lucky that I did not usually succeed, in those terms I set for myself. One general lesson is that there are vital lessons to be learned from failure, and we often ought to be glad for many, indeed most, of the inevitable setbacks to our plans and desires. This is why people who do not acknowledge their failures, or those who regard themselves as victims, are in such deep spiritual trouble. Only by acknowledging failure can we learn, and we are alive, mainly, to learn. But on the other side, there are some moments when everything, so many good possibilities, apparently hinge upon attaining a particular success, in a fashion that is existentially intoxicating and undermining. We must then do our bit, make the right choices and stick by them, although most of what happens to generate that situation seems very much out of our hands, as if requiring astonishing chains of coincidence. My conclusion includes that providence is of extreme importance in our lives, especially considering that most people think that the notion of providence is impossible, merely pathetic, idiotic nonsense. But while providence often helps us when have done little or nothing to deserve help, it cannot and should not be relied upon to lead our life for us. Indeed, although providence is indispensable, our lives would be literally worth less if providence was the whole story. There always comes a point when we need to make choices in the context of a situation that providence has served up to us. And that is when what we want becomes of supreme importance. The cause of your church's destruction is one manifestation of large-scale causes operating at a civilizational level. Bruce Charlton. People are always trying to explain the problem of Christian churches, and indeed all types of church, in terms of some specific malign influence. This specific problem varies, to the point of being opposite, among analyzers. One pundit says his church's problem is infiltration by modern/trendy pressures from the left, for example pacifism, socialism, feminism, anti-racism, inclusivity. But another commenter says almost the opposite. That the specific problem with his Christian church is that it is reactionary, right-wing, outdated and has failed to adapt to modern cultural conditions. At this level of specific causes, opposite sides can both make a reasonable argued case, therefore it seems an endless pseudo-debate, hence futile, to persist with discourse at this specific level. Furthermore, as well as falsely specific putative causes, analysis almost always focuses on some specific Christian church. This is a deeper difficulty, since every devout Christian church member, by definition, regards his own church as unique. So the fact that what afflicts his particular church also afflicts every other Christian church carries no weight with him. When a trend of combined mass apostasy, failure of recruitment, corruption of leaders, and non-religious emphasis in church activities is evident in his own church, the fact that the same pattern has been seen in every other denomination and over many decades is regarded as almost irrelevant by the devout church member. General experience is not relevant because they are not us, because all of them are wrong, and only we are right. But to my eye, the overwhelming fact of Christian decline is that all churches are affected in the same way, and in all Western nations, and this trend has been established and accelerating for at least 70 years. By seeking specific causes for particular churches, we are clearly missing the crucial point. My conclusion is that what is happening to destroy your church, is at a very large scale, and is operating at a civilizational level, which is why no church and no religion is exempt. Dylan Thomas's prose. Bruce Charlton. I was introduced to the work of Dylan Thomas at exactly the right moment, which was that post-Lord of the Rings era, after I first had felt the impact of major literary greatness, and began to seek more. The medium was a one-man show in Bristol by David Ponting, a dental patient of my father's, who went on to portray Thomas hundreds more times through his life, and all over the world. As I recall it, the show was in a small and intimate theatrical venue, perhaps at the Old Vic Theatre School or somewhere in Bristol University, where I think Ponting worked. It was a biography using quotations from Thomas's poetry and prose works, mainly, and Ponting shifted between narration and acting the role of Thomas. After this I read a good deal of Thomas, perhaps all of his stories and some articles and essays, nearly all of which I liked a lot. I also tackled the poems, where my appreciation is more varied and selective. I do not much enjoy his early poems, and find Do Not Go Gentle to be highly aversive in meaning. Several others I rate highly, and my absolute favorite, and one of the best poems ever, for me, is the second last published in the collected poems, Fern Hill. This is the one that starts now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs and ends as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means / time held me green and dying / though I sang in my chains like the sea. But it is Thomas's prose that has had the biggest impact on me. He wrote wonderfully well about middle-late childhood and adolescence. Some of the pieces are bittersweet, like life, such as several stories in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog, including Who Do You Wish Was With Us? Read here by the magnificent Philip Maddock. Thomas wrote some of the most completely enjoyable and perfectly made examples of short humor I have encountered, such as A Child's Christmas in Wales and The Outing, originally titled A Story. The short prose form most suited his particular genius, and when he wrote consecutively at greater length, such as Under Milkwood, there get to be dull patches and a sense of contrivance, in between the marvels. How deep was Dylan Thomas? Was he more than a supreme wordsmith and sentimentalist? I think he was. I think he was one of the greatest 20th century writers, because he understood and memorably expressed both the delights and the tragedy of life. This is why Thomas always has spoken powerfully to so many serious general readers beyond the professional and the academic, like the many thousands, all over the world, who saw David Ponting's show, over several decades. Dylan Thomas's actual life, as told in Paul Ferris's biography, and in stark contrast to the mass media propagated legend, was badly marred by immaturity, dishonesty, selfishness, and sheer self-destructiveness. But underneath and fundamentally is evident a strongly religious conviction and aspiration, a cosmic perspective, which both frames and permeates even his comic writings. God is nearly always a hidden presence, even when unmentioned. The opening of Who Do You Wish Was With Us?
Birds in the crescent trees were singing. Boys on bicycles were ringing their bells and pedaling down the slight slope to make the whirs in their wheels startle the women gabbing on the sunny doorsteps. Small girls on the pavement, wheeling young brothers and sisters in prams, were dressed in their summer best and with colored ribbons. On the circular swing in the public playground, children from the snot school spun themselves happy and sick, crying swing us. And swing us. And, ooh, I'm falling. The morning was as varied and bright as though it were an international or a jubilee when Raymond Price and I, flanneled and hatless, with sticks and haversacks, set out together to walk to the Worm's Head. Striding along, in step, through the square of the residential uplands, we brushed by young men in knife-creased whites and showing-off blazers, and hockey-legged girls with towels round their necks and celluloid sunglasses, and struck a letterbox with our sticks, and bullied our way through a crowd of day trippers who waited at the stop of the Gower-bound buses, and stepped over luncheon baskets, not caring if we trod in them. "Why can't those bus lizards walk?" Ray said. "They were born too tired," I said. We went on up Sketty Road at a great speed, our haversacks jumping on our backs. We rapped on every gate to give a terrific walker's benediction to the people in the choking houses. Like a breath of fresh air we passed a man in office pinstripes standing, with a dog lead in his hand, whistling at a corner. Tossing the sounds and smells of the town from us with the swing of our shoulders and loose-limbed strides, halfway up the road we heard women on an outing call Mutt and Jeff. For Ray was tall and thin and I was short. Streamers flew out of the charabanc. Ray, sucking hard at his bulldog pipe, walked too fast to wave and did not even smile. I wondered whom I had missed among the waving women bowling over the rise. My love to come, with a paper cap on, might have sat at the back of the outing, next to the barrel, but, once away from the familiar roads and swinging towards the coast, I forgot her face and voice, that had been made at night, and breathed the country air in.
I recently discovered an ancient program from a performance it attended of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, acted by students at the Old Vic Theatre School circa 1974-5, in which the non-speaking part of a spear carrier was done by a certain Peter Postlethwaite. Everybody has to start somewhere. The Reality of Evil. William Wildblood. It is remarkable how few people nowadays can bring themselves to acknowledge the reality of supernatural evil. Could the reason be that if they did, they would have to admit the possibility of supernatural good and therefore of God? Do people not admit the reality of evil because then they would have to confess their sins, putting it in good old-fashioned terms? If you don't see the activity of evil in the world, since forever but especially over the last couple of centuries, it can only be because you have closed your mind to its possibility, and that may be because your worldview would then have to change so radically and you would have to accept spiritual responsibility. If you want to carry on without having your pleasant existence disturbed, indulging your favorite sins even if they are mild compared to some and not seen as sins by modern liberal standards, then you cannot acknowledge evil, and that not only does it exist but it has an agenda. It may be hard to see the activity of evil if you only look in terms of a limited time frame, as we are increasingly trained to do, divorced as we are from tradition and history, but if you stand back a little and take the longer view, then it is blazingly obvious. Consider how our minds and attitudes have shifted over the last century or so. Bit by bit we have been moved further away from God and even nature towards an artificial, this world-only mindset that sees human beings exclusively in terms of their outer forms, by which I don't just mean bodies but material selves, including the mental and emotional aspects which are as material as the physical, seen from the spiritual standpoint. Go back 100 years, though it might just as easily be 200 or even 300, this is an ongoing phenomenon, long in the preparation. You are a member of the devil's high command. You have to propose an agenda for the corruption of humanity, a fast track to damnation. I say fast track because it is that, given how historical movements normally proceed, but it may not seem that rapid to us in the context of our 70 or 80 years on this planet, but that's nothing in terms of humanity as a whole. Your task is to introduce ideas that will gradually but increasingly separate man from God, and you have to do so in a manner that to the naive and ignorant might actually seem good and as though they will improve society. What would you suggest? Firstly, you might try to undermine the reality both of God and religion by attacking those elements of religion that have accrued over the centuries but which are peripheral to the core message. You might get some clever people in the world whom you can influence because of their lack of faith or intellectual vanity or desire for prestige to formulate theories that purport to show there is no rational need for a divine creator to explain the universe. They will not need to be wicked people, but their flaws can be exploited. The attack on religion is made simpler because all religions really are now outdated, so their flaws can be pointed out and used to undermine the whole. Next, you might suggest measures to dismantle the centrality of the family, because the family is the reflection on earth of a great spiritual fact. Undo it and you separate men and women from truth, leaving them open to the lie. These measures will ostensibly be to protect or acknowledge people who fall outside the family for whatever reason, and to say they are just as good as those inside, which may be true but is used as a means to destroy what is inside and an essential good. You might propose presenting ideas which see children as distractions or impediments to personal fulfillment instead of being the means to fulfillment, which is the case. You might also push to extend the definition of the family, thereby destroying what it really is, which is a father, mother and children that come from them, by replacing it with what it isn't, all in the name of tolerance and inclusivity. It's a clever ploy to keep the outer trappings of something while replacing what is within as though it was still the same thing. Then you might deconstruct the past and seek to separate people from their roots. People without roots have no depth and are easily herded wherever you might want them to go. This could be through education on the one hand, and immigration, on the other, a two-pronged attack that obliges people to think of themselves in terms of a new definition of what a modern member of a particular society is, because that is the only definition that will accommodate both the native and the stranger under just one umbrella. Attack the past to reframe the present in the style you want. You might suggest stimulating consumerism, that being the constant and insatiable desire to fill up a perceived emptiness, as this fixes consciousness on the material plane better than almost anything else. except sex. And so you would overstimulate this to an absurd degree, separating it from love and making it absolutely central to all culture and much sense of self-worth. At the same time as stimulating the sexual instinct, you would propose dismantling the difference between men and women, because then neither will be happy and society as a whole will start to break down as a result of it bending to accommodate something that is only possible when there is a lot of meat already on the bone. Feminism, aka equality, can only exist in a culture that has built up wealth and power, so there is a lot to spare. Or else in a primitive culture which has nothing anyway. Otherwise it tends to be parasitical because it feeds off its host, the society in question. Then, in line with the consumerism, make it all about the economy. Make that the justification for everything and everything subsidiary to that. Money replaces God. And in case none of that is enough, why not attack, dismantle and break down beauty? Call the ugly beautiful and relativize everything in line with a general destruction of hierarchical values. All this, of course, in the name of unity, fairness and equality, the new anti-value values. This is only a start, and there is a good deal more that the devil can do, has been doing, to degrade human souls. For example, life overstimulates us now to the point at which inner stillness is totally impossible for most people. We are always after the next hit and then the next and so on. Our institutions, built to sustain and protect us, have been hollowed out and exist now as bureaucratic leviathans whose only real purpose is self-perpetuation. Even the spiritual, where it exists, tends to be a playground for the ego, in many cases captured and misrepresented as a means of human, i.e. personal, development. All this is at the same time subtle but blindingly obvious when you know how to look. Surely we can see that everything is in one direction now. And it only ever goes further in that direction, despite occasional attempts at course correction. This should be enough to show us the source of the trends and where that source wants to take us. But then we would have to acknowledge the reality of supernatural evil, and that would require us to confess our sins and turn to God. The scale of the attack might seem overwhelming, given that it is everywhere and on every front. But the remedy is simple. Just see it for what it is. The devil likes to hide. Drag him out in the open by revealing his works and he loses power. Once his tricks are exposed, he becomes impotent. What must remain beyond God's purview? Francis Berger. Traditional Christian theologies rest on the assertion that God is omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent. Despite this, the same theologies also posit free will and absolve God from the presence of evil in creation. The contradiction inherent between these two poles of belief is readily apparent and difficult to ignore. Christian theologians understood that providing some semblance of coherence to the blatant contradiction was of utmost importance. They also knew that placing freedom and evil beyond the purview of God was the only logical way of reconciling evil/freedom and omnigod. However, this recognition also provided a daunting challenge. How do you place freedom/evil beyond the purview of God, who is asserted to be absolute, ultimate, and omni-everything? When crafting their solutions to this dilemma, theologians prioritized God's omni-status over the reality of freedom and evil. Although the answers such theologies put forward cohere to a certain extent, the rabid defense of God's ultimate status failed to provide the room needed to explain freedom and evil meaningfully. As a result, we have what I regard as largely nebulous half-answers and non-answers. And I suppose that marks the point at which all my scant theological explorations and scribblings embark from. The early theologians were right: if freedom and evil are to make any sense at all, they must be placed beyond the purview of God. The biggest issue I have with early theologians is their inability to place freedom and evil far enough beyond God. If freedom and evil are really real, as I believe that they are, then they must be entirely beyond or very close to entirely beyond the purview of God. Early traditional theologians and Christian thinkers were loath to take that step because it entailed encroaching upon a non-negotiable, God's power. The true nature of freedom and evil could not be satisfactorily explained without degrading and diminishing God's omni status, which had to be preserved at all costs. Freedom and evil be damned. Although I understand the impetus that drives such thinking, it ultimately paints itself into a corner. The obsession with divine power hinders fully coherent explanations of freedom and evil. It also sidesteps questions related to God's motives for creation and ultimately takes refuge in the fortress of mystery, miracle, and authority. I believe that any valid understanding of freedom and evil must entail a reduced focus on the abstract unreality of God's power and instead encompass the concrete reality of God's love. The existential perspective on life, living in an exalted, enchanted state is paid for by increased alienation and servitude. Bruce Charlton. One of the most misleading aspects of hearing tell of the experience of spiritual exaltation, is that such high states have been paid for by servitude. To experience the kind of powerful enchantment that gets written about, extracts a cost in exacerbated mundane living. Consider a successful pilgrimage, long and arduous, expensive and tedious travel, and all the organization beforehand. The spiritual high point must be been paid for in advance and upfront. Or meditation. Months and years of routine, work, training, tedium, seeking a breakthrough into an enlightenment of understanding and bliss, which, unless death follows quickly, is, itself, inevitably a state, dissolving into the mundane again. Such is the nature of this mortal life on this world, a trade-off, on unfavorable terms. The heights entail extra depths, just as that holiday of a lifetime entails a preceding lifetime of daily drudgery. At the most fundamental level, the business of staying alive, food, shelter, clothes, defense etc., exacts long hours and heavy responsibilities. And there is no way out, no escape, so long as we live. This is the equation, the scales are tipped against us. We can try not to think about this, can try to pretend it is not so, can distract ourselves, even obliterate our awareness with extreme intoxication, but this is the reality, and it is much, much harder even to ignore this reality than people pretend. It is one thing to say that we don't need to think about it, that sensible people just get on with the business of life as is, or that we change our perspective to concentrate on the good and reinterpret the bad stiff so as to enjoy it. Easy to say, easy to claim. And yet to me the evidence is overwhelming that the existential nature of people's actual lives, and the deep and persisting pathologies of actual human society, distinctly undermine such optimistic but facile attempts at reframing. Reality, yes, but not the only reality. There is far more to life than this harsh equation, thanks be. But it is the start of wisdom to acknowledge this situation as an inescapable, daily, hourly, fact of the human condition. Such is the existential perspective, the overview of human existence, but such recognition ought to be a starting point to consider what are its implications for each of us, personally. Contrary to the atheistic existentialists of the mid-20th century, grasping the existential perspective is not supposed to be the terminus of thinking, nor an excuse for not thinking. From the EP as a baseline, we need to grasp the situation as is, and as fully as possible, as honestly as possible, from our own inward point of view. The aim being to establish what, given the solid reality of the situation, we would most want, and what possibilities we believe are available. Becoming more divine. Poetry as an example of theosis. Bruce Charlton. If, in a simplified way, if salvation is the purpose of this mortal life, then theosis is the meaning of it. In other words, theosis, i.e. becoming more divine, is what we are supposed to be doing on a daily basis. But what this means is far from clear. To say that love is primary, and we should become more loving is true, but somehow too abstract, and in a way too static. It doesn't provide much of an idea of what we ought to be trying to do now, this minute, in a few hours, and over the next days, months, years. I find that creativity is as aspect of love, an overflow of love, such that God's divine creation can be understood as a manifestation of God's love. But what is creativity as we know it and do it in mortal life? Well, there are serious problems with the way we think about creation. Two of these problems are that, first, we regard creativity as associated with specific activities, especially the arts, which means that creativity is defined externally, by human institutions. Secondly, and linked to this, we regard this externally defined creativity as needing a minimum threshold of ability and achievement. Take the example of poetry. Poetry has long been socially defined as a creative activity. Intrinsically, we assume that a poet is creative. Traditionally, the status of being a poet must be conferred upon a person. However, this poet status requires some external and objective criteria to be satisfied. Publication of your poetic work, perhaps specifically publication by a high-status publisher, or attracting a paying audience to readings, or being employed as a teacher of poetry, are examples of how the claimed status of a poet is accredited. These are assumed to be measures of writing what is regarded as real poetry. For example, a shopping list or a bureaucratic memo does not count as a poem, while also achieving the minimum necessary poetic ability. Thus, traditionally, a poet is one who has produced work of a type and standard worthy of being called poetry. This is because writing poetry is so easy and so common that otherwise the status, and it is a status, a socially sanctioned role, of poet could, and probably would, be claimed by something approaching the majority of the population. But this is to treat poetry as a social function and privilege, not as a spiritual activity. Insofar as poetry is treated as a profession, it is not a valid mode of theosis. However, the alternative to having external standards of definition for poetry and poets, would seem to be reducing the whole things to meaninglessness and futility. If poetry is just whatever people say it is, and poets are whoever wants to claim the name, then the concept has no function. The answer seems to be that poetry as a creative spiritual activity needs to be removed from the external and public sphere of definitions and evaluations. And when this is done, poetry ceases to be regarded as an intrinsically creative activity. Such an understanding means that poetry is no more creative of itself than any other activity a person might engage in, such as preparing food, gardening, or humming a tune. The evaluations and definitions of spiritual creation then become a matter between the individual person and God, sidestepping society and institutions altogether. Of course, people can and will be dishonest with themselves, will fool themselves, but then this is subject to spiritual feedback. By pretending to be creating but not really doing it, people are only harming themselves, spiritually. If someone desires theosis, desires to participate in divine creation, then it is up to that individual, and nobody else, really to do just that, to the best of his knowledge and ability, calibrated by the most fundamental discernments of which that person is capable. With spirituality and this world we cannot have it both ways. if poetry is being done for spiritual reasons, as an aspect of theosis, it ought to be kept separate from the social system that defines and evaluates poetry, and which allocates status on that basis. The spiritual poet is engaged in activity related to participation in divine creation, and there are no external objective sources that have the authority to determine such matters over and superior to our own best evaluation of the matter. A spiritual poet is someone who finds that doing something he himself honestly regards as being rather like what gets called poetry, is a good way to pursue creativity in theosis. Such an activity will not be recognized or rewarded socially, nor will it be accorded a higher status than any other of the thousands of alternative ways in which a person might be creative. What then is the reward? The reward of creating is twofold, immediate and post-resurrection. The immediate reward is that creating is satisfying, profoundly satisfying, to a Christian, because by it he joins with God and Jesus Christ in the work of divine creation. But such rewards are temporary in this mortal life, so creating is not cumulative, or not necessarily, and seldom cumulative, during mortal life. I mean that the benefits of theosis do not, or only seldom, accumulate incrementally during mortal life. We don't get more and more divine as mortal men by our creativity. That is, creative accumulation is spiritual, not material. What happens is that we do get a benefit from each and every creative activity, and it does build up, but lasting benefit comes after death when we are resurrected. The more creatively we have lived as mortals, the more divine shall be the form in which we are resurrected. Just as it true for loving, which is not separable from creating, the more loving our lives, the more divine we shall be as we commence eternal life in heaven. The intractable problem of moral legalism in Christian discourse. Bruce Charlton. If there is one area of life in which discussion is futile, it is when trying to persuade a moral legalist in a situation where somebody has transgressed a law, rule or principle, that he regards as both absolute and primary. Such people cannot be made to recognize that the crucial move in their argument has been their own personal choice to regard values as existing ultimately in the form of laws. As well as, secondly, the choice to place this law, here and now, as above all other laws that could, in principle, be applied to the situation under discussion. In other words, any possible argument has already been pre-decided by the prior choice of these laws as necessarily valid and supreme, and the prior choice to apply this law here and now. Moral legalists have taken a vastly complex situation unfolding in real time, and applied to it a grossly simplified model, that begs all the most fundamental questions. On the one hand we have life, but on the other hand a set of laws and relations between laws. These laws are then claimed to be descriptive of the ultimate truth about life. The claim is that life derives from laws. In other words, the man-assumed model of reality, which is the laws, is given primacy over all the multitude of details of that existence in which we find ourselves. There can be no relevant evidence for this assumption of the primacy of law. It is an act of faith, a personal decision. Such moral legalists, and they are legion, and occur in all Christian denominations, cannot be persuaded, because they regard every attempt to point out the fact of their assumptions, and that all such assumptions depend upon a personal choice of what to believe, as a challenge to their core moral values, hence as necessarily emanating from an evil tempter. One who debates a moral legalist, is subjectively assigned a, literally, demonic role. The reaction to any challenge to the assumption of the validity and applicability of law is therefore typically extreme, and always negative. And also projective, in the sense that it attributes motivation in absence of knowledge. any pointing out of my assumptions as assumptions is experienced as an evil motivated attack on what I have assumed to be ultimate good. Naturally enough, albeit mistakenly and sinfully, this may subjectively be regarded as justifying, or even requiring, moralistic zeal, justifying an extreme response against this threat. Thus moral legalism is, I believe, a major cause of the extraordinary extremity of hostile rhetoric from some Christians online, and sometime IRL, and a cause of the inability of so many Christians to learn from experience, from life. Because when these laws have been accorded metaphysical primacy by assumption, then anything that happens in life can have nothing to teach us about the validity and applicability of these laws. Note added, if not, then what? If not moral legalism, then what instead? The answer lies in distinguishing the limitations of this actual mortal life from the ideal situation of heaven, and in remembering the ultimate primacy of heaven. Here and now in this vast and impersonal world as is, we are stuck with legalism and bureaucracy as inevitable evils. Laws can be improved and reduced, implementation should be supervised and shaped by wise human judgment, but all laws are ultimately wrong. And yet we are stuck with them, especially when it comes to public and societal morality. We can, and should, try to exclude laws and law-like rules as much as possible from a loving marriage, family, and strong friendships. For the same reason, we should resist the temptation to conceptualize loving marriages and families in terms of societal derived models, destructive errors such as regarding the family as essentially structured like a social institution, as analogous to a mini-nation, as properly ruled by monarch, or democracy, or whatever. However, heavenly morality and values are wholly relational, i.e. rooted in love between persons, and there is no place for laws in heaven. This is what we need to hold in mind, in order to avoid the self-blinded and destructive zealotry of the self-defined Christian, but often net evil, and in practice demon-aligned, moral legalists. Psychology and the Soul. William Wildblood. For many people in the modern materialistic world, psychology has replaced religion, but how can you heal the mind if you don't acknowledge the soul? And most forms of psychology, despite the name, do not acknowledge the soul except sometimes when it is envisaged as an aspect or extension of the mind. Human beings consist of a body, a mind and a soul, all three of which must be aligned and interacting harmoniously for an individual to be in a healthy state. All three are important to the whole, but there is a hierarchical relationship between them, which is to say the soul has a mind and a body rather than the other way around. So, I do not have a soul. I am the soul. If the spiritual is not taken into account, a person will not be in a healthy psychological condition, and while not everyone will feel the impact of this, there will still be damage. To attempt to heal the mind without acknowledging spiritual factors is superficial at best. Some forms of psychology do attempt to integrate a spiritual element into their thinking, but they do this by making the spiritual a subset of the psychological, so giving a false idea of the spiritual by reducing it to the psychological. But the spiritual exists at a level of being beyond the psychological, and the psychological cannot touch it. All it can do is create a conceptual framework for it, but if that is mistaken for the real thing, any true connection to the soul is lost. The soul is sometimes described as beyond form, but this is not strictly true. It does not have material form, but it has a spiritual form which is its quality. It takes on form in order to express itself in the material world, but then it mistakenly identifies itself with the form assumed. It forgets its true nature. Psychology addresses itself to the mind, but the mind is part of the form the soul takes in order to interact with the world. If there is not a clear understanding of the difference between mind and soul, psychology cannot address deeper problems when they arise, and they will even if one is not aware of it with the outer self. We can go further than this, and apply the same line of reasoning to religion. Does religion bring us into relationship with the soul, or does it supplant that relationship with itself? It depends on how an individual views his religion. Does he see it as a path to God and the soul, or a replacement for God and the soul? Often it is a bit of both, but we must, especially now when all religions are spiritual shadows of their former selves, recognize that religion belongs to the world of form and that true spiritual understanding must lie beyond that. In the end times, religions lose their power for two reasons, one bad, one good. The bad reason is the prevailing atheism and egotism of a large section of humanity. The good reason is that an increasing number of people see that the form of religion is an inevitable limitation on the higher understanding. That is not to reject religion, because if that limitation is recognized, one can go beyond it while still using the good in religion as a guide and support. But a religion is rather like one of those rockets that enable a spaceship to escape the Earth's gravity but must then be jettisoned if the ship is to advance deeper into space. This may not always have been so, but has become so in our day when end times energy affects everything in the world. Morality does not derive from laws. Bruce Charlton. Morality does not derive from laws. Morality derives from God, from the nature, purposes and methods of God, as manifested in divine creation. The morality of men derives from their personal affiliation to God. The morality enabling affiliation to God must be personal. It may or may not also be collective in different places and eras, but it must be personal. Note, this is intended as a summary statement of the argument behind today's earlier post. Not a war to win, but a war to destroy. Bruce Charlton. Long-term, 6-year plus, readers will know of my recurrent obsession with the subject of evil, and the nature and definition of evil. This is because I believe that the nigh universal lack of understanding of evil has rendered almost everybody helpless in the face of a very powerful class of persons who have successfully engaged the hearts and minds of a very high proportion of the population of the West, and many other places. Bluntly, lack of understanding of evil has led many hundreds of millions of people, at least, into supporting strategic evil, and with a clear conscience, because they regard that evil as actually good. In other words, the inability to understand the nature of evil has led to moral inversion. What is really and intentionally evil is regarded as good, and vice versa. And people are not, as they may once have been, merely victims of manipulation, because it is of the nature of evil that once embraced it increases, evil feeds upon itself. Thus we find that the nicest people are, on average, the most deluded, the most likely to be most powerfully supportive of the strategies of evil. This is particularly stark when the strategy being supported is a deliberately maximally destructive war. And a war intended to embrace in destruction its supporters, themselves, their families and friends, their homeland, their ideology and passionate convictions, all that they superficially suppose that they hold most dear. A world war is openly being planned, with full public declaration, before our eyes, in the mass media, in the West, in the UK and Commonwealth, EU nations, the USA, and beyond. Indeed, this war is becoming the only game in town, as a long-term strategy war is displacing all the other evil-motivated plans/good causes, such as I term the litmus tests: socialism/leftism, CO2 climate environmentalism, birdemic healthism, anti-racism and feminism, the sexual revolution, etc. All are being wound down, and preparations for war are building up. What is worse, or rather worst, is that this war, which is, in part, intended to be an expansion of the war that has been going in Eastern Europe over the past 4+ years, and in the Middle East more recently, and incipiently in East Asia, is not a war to win, but a war intended to destroy. What is already afoot and expanding in Europe, is war of a kind seldom or never seen before in human history. In this actual and coming war, although one side does indeed want to win, and wants an end to the war, or begins that way, those who control the other side want this war to continue, to expand, to increase in intensity, without end point. This happens because those who control one side are not of that side, but are instead, successfully and without being detected, using that side primarily and ultimately to pursue all-round destructive purposes. This is happening, the strategy is working, things are much worse than almost anyone, including the experts, realize, exactly because almost nobody in the West understands evil, and especially they do not understand the sheer negativity of evil. War analysts, of all sides, consistently assume that war is about seeking benefit, a negative means towards positive goals, and will end when that benefit has been attained. But when a war has been created, and is being sustained and expanded, in order to destroy, and ultimately in order that the participants come to support that goal of destruction, then this is a very different matter. The developing war situation is one that cannot necessarily be stopped or reversed, even if there was a general and effective will to stop it, which there is not. Evil has such an easy time in the modern world because there are so very few people, and none with power, who are strongly on the side of God and good. The mass of people cannot and do not support good because they do not believe good exists, or has any objective meaning. Their vague notion of good is something that exists, temporarily, only psychologically, as culturally contingent notions in the heads of themselves, and people like them. The idea that the good is a part of reality, or the universe, is literally meaningless to mainstream modern people. It is not so much denied as something that simply does not make sense. But we need to recall that the war of this world is always and ultimately a spiritual war, so this is no exception. This is ultimately war to induce people, as many as possible people, on all sides, to align with spiteful destruction as a spiritual goal. And this happens by value inversion, by inducing people to regard evil as good and vice versa, and this is easiest when evil is not understood. And this failure to understand evil becomes inevitable when people do not believe in or understand good. And this failure to understand goodness is inevitable because so many people have assimilated the official and culturally mainstream fundamental assumptions, for example that there is no God, no spirit, no salvation, no possibility of external and objective purpose and meaning in the universe. The ongoing and accelerating war of destruction is a consequence of these deep and multi-generational cultural trends. This stuff is not some hypothetical future scenario, on the contrary, this state of deep incomprehension and value inversion describes where we are now, culturally. And where we are stuck, because it can be seen that the problems run very deep, and have many layers. Which is presumably why we are all marching blandly and blindly towards a vastly destructive and intentionally endless war that nearly everyone supports indirectly with sadistic vehemence. Note, those who publicly oppose the ongoing upcoming war are also, very nearly always, part of the fundamental problem that has led to the war, and share the same war-generating fundamental assumptions. They do not oppose the war for good reasons. Entropy is not a part of evil, these are two separate problems. Bruce Charlton. The problem of entropy is one that presses upon us the average mortal life perhaps more strongly than evil. By entropy I mean the universal tendency for beings to experience cumulative adverse change with time, dysfunction, degeneration, disease, and the ultimate manifestation of entropy is death. All of these are unavoidable, are universal. Traditional Christian theology usually conflates entropy with evil. Indeed, entropy/death is usually subsumed within the concept and causes of evil. For example, the traditional interpretation of the Adam and Eve story is that they began as good and immortal beings, free from both evil and death. With the fall they chose evil, and at the same time necessarily became mortal, subject to entropy and death. In traditional theology, with the salvation from Jesus Christ we are allowed to return to the primal situation of Adam and Eve, saved from our self-caused punishment of both entropy and evil. After their fall, Adam and Eve and their descendants also needed to toil in order to live. In effect, toil was needed to overcome entropy. Because, in effect, entropy meant that, over time, our minds and bodies and the environment are all against us, we must make efforts every day, we need to toil simply to remain alive and functional, but all such efforts are temporary, palliative, will inevitably be overcome and will fail. In this sense, entropy is a more pervasive problem than evil. And ultimately all of this bad stuff supposedly happens because of the fall. Everything bad is down to an evil choice of ancestors, and its ramifications. This is very difficult to comprehend or believe. There seems a gross disproportion between the events described in Genesis, and thousands of years of billions of people's suffering and toil, disease and dying in fighting, and failing to defeat entropy. Well, be that as it may, traditional theology regards evil as primary, entropy as a part of evil. Evil is the ultimate cause of entropy. Therefore trad theol has it that we overcome entropy by overcoming sin, where sin is understood to mean the manifestations of evil. That is, the repentance of evil/sins, leads also to the escape from entropy, leads to eternally healthy and vigorous, and happy, life in heaven. I have described elsewhere my understanding that entropy and evil can and should be distinguished, and that they have different causes. Entropy is intrinsic to this creation, the one we inhabit now, to the original or primary creation by God, this creation that we are born into. Heaven can be conceptualized as the answer to entropy, by a second and opt-into creation, i.e. the creation made possible by Jesus Christ, with resurrection conceptualized as a voluntary remaking without entropy, as leaving behind entropy. So, while traditional Christian theology regards entropy death as secondary to evil, and regards heaven as the answer to entropy death because, in repenting moral sins and having the effect of sins removed by Jesus, we also and simultaneously eliminate entropy. But instead, I regard entropy and evil as ultimately distinct concepts. In this creation, entropy is unavoidable, while evil is a choice. However, the confusion and conflation of entropy and evil among Christians seems to be a consequence of the fact that the answer to both entropy and evil is the same, i.e. resurrection and our escape/progression into eternal, holy good life in heaven, by following Jesus Christ. In a nutshell, entropy and evil are different problems with different causes in this world, but both problems are cured by the same treatment, following Jesus Christ to heaven. And otherwise they are not cured. One who does not follow Jesus to heaven, has thereby chosen to continue to live with entropy and evil. Note added, the difference is that entropy is intrinsic to the nature of God's creation, the first creation. Evil is about a specific being's attitude towards creation, positive or negative, affiliative or hostile.